Welcome to I Storm Women's channel and the 16 Days of Activism podcast in support of UN Women UK and fundraising for Safe Spaces Now.
Public spaces need to be safe and inclusive for all now. A report by UN Women UK reveals how common sexual harassment is in the UK. 97% of women my age said they had experienced harassment. Your ideas to support us have already started making a change. At music festivals, with taxi companies, on public transport, in organisations and in online spaces. It's time for a change. Please support Safe Spaces Now by donating to the cause or get involved. You can find the link next to this video. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us in this campaign to create awareness around violence against women and girls. In this episode, we're talking about adultification, specifically adultification bias. Now, I'd like to warn you that this talk can be triggering or upsetting for some people, so do take care and feel free to switch off if you need to. My name is Atonte Semira. I'm Head of Community at UN Women UK, part of UN Women, which is the only organisation fighting for gender equality globally. And I'm so pleased to have two participants on today's podcast to discuss adultification bias. We have Kafayat, who is a Black feminist community worker specialising in ending violence against women and girls and advocating for the rights of women and girls. And we have Heritage Sanmi-Lawal, who is a gender and international development consultant, currently pursuing her master's degree in international human rights law at the University of Leicester. But that's all I'm going to say about these two amazing women, because I'm going to hand over and let you introduce yourselves and talk about your relation to the topic of adultification bias. So Kafayat, if you could tell us a bit more about you, that would be great.
Thank you. Thank you for that warm welcome. It's great to be here. So as Atonte mentioned, my name is Kafayat Okanlawon, and I'm a community worker that has been working in the violence against women and girls sector over the last 10 years. I also am a founder of an organization called House of Lavender that's dedicated to creating spaces for Black women and girls to have some joy and have some fun. We do painting, we do all different types of events. And I'm also the curator and editor of a book called This Is Us, Black British Women and Girls. In terms of this topic, adultification bias, I guess really leaning into my work around child sexual exploitation, I saw a lot of adultification bias with the young women and young men that I work with. And yeah, I guess we'll speak about that today.
Thank you so much, Kafayat, and all your work will be linked below, and I can't wait to read your book. And Heritage, tell us about you.
Thank you so much, Atonte, and it's such a great joy to be here. Well, not really, because I mean, what we're talking about is quite serious, but it's still a pleasure to be here on this platform today. So I would say very little about what I do. As a gender and international development consultant, one thing that is very important to me is the work I do on, eradicating sexual violence and gender-based violence. And, I also run an organization in Nigeria focusing on the empowerment of women and girls. And one major issue that we have come across is child marriage. And we have linked this very closely with the adultification bias, going on, globally. And this led to, let's say, my research and my work and advocacy as well against gender-based violence. So I really hope to have a very enlightening discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. So excited to have, well, again, not excited, but so eager to have this conversation with you both. So I thought it would be great to start by establishing what we mean by adultification bias in general. So you've both alluded to it there in your introductions. But I found just a very simple, plain definition that I wanted to start with, which is that adultification bias is a social or cultural stereotype that is based on how adults perceive children in the absence of knowledge of children's behavior and verbalizations. And I think that kind of encapsulates, what it is, but it's quite dry. And we want to get into the detail of what that really means in practice. So Kafayat, could you tell us a bit more about what exactly adultification bias is?
Yeah, And as you said, I think that's a great definition to just, I guess, encapsulate what it means. But there's really something about bringing it to life and actually what it means in young people's lives. And I think for me, if I look at adultification bias in an intersectional way, I think many young people come up. So when I think about, for example, if I think about racism and race and thinking about actually specifically how adultification bias affects young Black children and how that shows up in our safeguarding in our schools, if I think about, for example, young children who are in care and working with those who have been and leaving care, those 18 to 25, despite them being over the age of 18, there is still something about even when they're under the age of 18, they're treated in a particular way because essentially they have to live independently. So there's an expectation for them to just grow up and be adults without truly actually getting that, I guess, parental support that they need to really to be able to develop. Or, for example, thinking about young people who are caregivers and thinking about how there's this need for them to grow up and look after their own parents or look after their own siblings. Connecting that also just with this idea of culture. I know, for example, I'm the eldest daughter. And there's a pressure there around an expectation of looking after my younger siblings. Whilst it was a joy, you know, it also meant that I also had to grow up very quickly, and there's an expectation from me to, I guess, almost be a second mum. There's an expectation, there's this joke around, oh, you're the second mummy. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm just a girl myself. I'm still a child. And that follows us, especially particularly young Black people, young Black women, when we think about that that intersex of being Black and being a woman, or a girl, I should say, and that follows us into adulthood in terms of our expectation of being able to take stuff, to handle stuff, to take pain. And so for me, I think there's something about, if we're looking at the different layers, that essentially there's just this cultural norm of young women particularly expecting to be an adult and do adult things when we are still children.
Exactly. I think that's really interesting that you've highlighted that cultural context, because I think all of us here are familiar with that. I had a similar, although I'm not the oldest, I'm the oldest of 9-year age gap twin siblings. So very much parented them when I was a child myself, due to various different circumstances actually linked to gender-based violence as well. And I think what's interesting and what makes this issue particularly pervasive in the Black community and other similar cultures is that we have the adultification bias within our own community and then outside as well. And we'll talk a bit more about that later, but I think that's just what makes it so insidious as well. Heritage, was there any more thoughts you wanted to give on the definition of adultification bias?
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with both definitions. They have pretty much encapsulated everything that is there to know, especially the cultural part, because we tend to look over how dangerous this bias is, especially when it comes to reporting sexual violence and taking action against sexual violence. Let's say it's the bias kind of affects the stance that even laws take and policies take when it comes to addressing matters in the Black community. And this is really disheartening, because you can tell that it is from a bias that has no scientific justification for it. We do not have any reason in particular to believe that Black women, are born strong, in quotes. I think I've come to really hate that word strong, because it kind of depicts something. It's sending us a message that we do not have the right to speak up against violence, basically, and we do not have the right to be weak in that sense, and we do not have the right to feel certain emotions. And this has played into how sexual violence and violence in general is addressed in the Black community.
Exactly. In the Black community, outside of the Black community, within institutions and public services even. And I think one of the key things is that there is a real lack of data research and understanding of this issue. Yet it is a key driver of the statistics that show that Black women are more likely to be victims of sexual violence. And not only that, less likely to receive the care and support that they need and the justice. And when I was doing a bit of research about this prior to this podcast recording, I came across a report done by Georgetown Law Poverty Center, and this was the first of its kind, which is highly unacceptable, but I'm glad that it's happened. They released a report showing data of how adults view Black girls, and they view them as, and I saw this written a lot when I was doing my research, the taking away of innocence of Black girls and Black boys, and we're speaking mainly about Black girls today, but Black boys, the issue, as Kafayat mentioned in earlier, is just as pervasive. We see that with criminalization, etc. But Black girls are seen as less innocent and more adult-like than their white peers, especially in the age range of, and this is shocking, age 5 to 14. So as young as 5 years old, they're seen as less innocent and more adult-like. And I think there are some key bits that came out of the survey from Georgetown, and these it's upsetting, but what's really important is that we have the data, but we need way more. So Black girls need less nurturing, less. This is what respondents said they felt about Black girls: need less nurturing, less protection, need to be supported less, need to be comforted less, and are more independent, know more about adult topics, and know more about sex. And these results, they're profound. And, on an anecdotal level, we understand this already, but the data is absolutely key. So thinking about the data and, the systems that we have in place now, what can you say about adultification in general right now here in the UK? Because what I found when I was doing my research is there's a lot of talk, particularly within Black communities in the US, about this subject, and even outside of that, an example of this research paper. But what can we say about adultification bias in the UK and how prevalent that is in general heritage?
So I think, starting from the schools, because this is where the figures start getting very disheartening and very obvious to the eyes. I definitely think the rural communities have been left out as well. There are different parts of the UK that do not really show up in this data. And this is basically, we can't ignore the intersectional nature of gender equality and gender issues. The fact that race plays a major factor in even identifying adultification in the first place. So I really believe that this actually boils down to schools and the monitoring systems that we have in schools. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a form of data released on what teachers even think. I'm very curious to even understand what teachers think of the students, and in terms of their need for protection and need for nurturing, what they think as well, because this has really played into the educational system as well. But I think that's my opinion in that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I even saw a story this morning on this very issue involving a young Black boy. So Kafayat, talk to us a little bit more about the prevalence of adultification bias in the UK.
Yeah. I echo what you said about the Georgetown study. There's something that is great that is happening, but equally so crushing. The first time I understood or came to this notion of theory around adultification was this book that I read called Push Out. It's called Push Out: The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools by Monique W. Morris, who is American. And it, in one breath, was very saddening, but equally, as I said, it was mind-blowing, because I was like, oh my gosh, that's what that is, right? And I think about my experience being in a schooling system in the UK, and there was something specific about this book cover for me, especially the illustration of hair, right? Because when I was in school, I remember about 50% of the Black girls in my school were sent home because we had different colored extensions, and we were told that actually our hair wasn't our natural hair color, so we had to be sent home. That didn't happen to the young white girls in the school, or the girls with European hair who had colored their hair. And at the time, we didn't have a language for it. We were just like, this is just racist, and we didn't know. We was like, this is racist, but we knew it was more than that. So when this idea of adultification bias came up, there's this sense of like, okay, not only is it racism, but then there's this extra layer of the fact that because we're young Black girls, we aren't as innocent, or, you know, we know what we're doing and we're trying to get in trouble, and we're trying to stir up trouble within the school by coming in with this colored hair, as opposed to it seen as it being expressed. And so for me, I think the prevalence is, I think there is a lot of hidden stories that we don't know, because we're still actually just catching up to the fact that this thing is really happening. I think in the UK, there's this honest conversation that we can say, those who live here are just really coming to the understanding that racism is very real for us, as Black people. And so for the masses to truly actually understand what adultification is, I think is something that hasn't even been cracked yet. A good colleague, sister friend of mine, Janine Davis, has done a lot of research and work, and she did a study called Where Are All the Black Girls? And that was basically about adultification, and where are our stories? Where are our crying? Where is our hurt when we speak about sexual violence? And thinking about sexual violence as this thing that has happened, but also actually knowing that there's this thing, as you said, inside community and outside community, of the way that specifically young girls are treated in a particular way. And so I think that we haven't even cracked, you know, the iceberg in terms of understanding what the prevalence is, but knowing that is very, very high. Like when I spoke about being the eldest daughter, there's a sense of us all being like, yeah, we know them ones and we know what that means. And I definitely look forward to there being more language and understanding around it, so we can all actually identify it and say, okay, no, this is actually happening and it's a real thing. We saw what happened to schoolgirl child Q, right? And so that's a real life in our face case of what is happening here in the UK. And that is one out of, we only know how many. So yeah.
Exactly. And I think that the case of child Q really, you know, woke a lot of people up, or reignited that fire within the people who understood the issue in itself. I don't want to go too much detail on the specific case, because, you know, it was already, you know, this young woman would not have wanted this to happen, let alone to have this story out about her 14-year-old girl in school who was strip searched by a police officer. Also, while she was on her period, and ended up self-harming as a result of this, you know. And there was a huge conversation that came after that, you know, there was no consent from an adult in the room, and, you know, it was the issue that she was being searched for, was it necessary? Also, it was the teacher who reported it and called the police in, and there were so many things around this, and it got a lot of us speaking about, if it was somebody who didn't look like her, would she have been treated in that way? And what's so difficult is that we have so many anecdotal stories, and this is essentially another anecdotal story that thankfully hit the headlines so that we can continue to have this conversation. But it's not enough to have the conversation, like you say, because we need the data. We need a deep-rooted understanding of this issue so that we can root it out. And I think that, you know, my next question was going to be around stories around this issue, but actually I also wanted to highlight the fact that, you know, we're not, Black girls and other minoritized and marginalized girls, we see the same thing with disabled women as well. Disabled women are not seen as being sexual. Many Black disabled are not seen as being sexual. It's also, how could they be sexually assaulted? Black girls and Black women are seen as always wanting sex. So, you know, did they really ask for it? And there's a lot of victim blaming that goes on. And when it comes to girls specifically, where is the grace? That grace that is given to other young girls. But also we know that with other young girls, the issue is pervasive as well. We get victim blaming and all of that. But this just highlights the importance of intersectionality, where you see that marginalization is even worse when you bring in those intersectionalities of race, sexuality, whether or not one is disabled. So I think that, you know, that really highlights all of this, and these stories after story after story, you know, and do share any stories that you want to share once I stop talking, because I have a tendency to talk a lot. They're important.
If I just come in here quickly as well.
Yeah.
Just as you were speaking, something that came to mind, I think also adding this thing around class, and thinking about, whilst not necessarily speaking about stories that have hit the headline, happy to kind of draw my own experiences and thinking about that this need of, and it's interesting, this conversation I had with my mother recently, you know, which is really beautiful, about some of the things that I guess for her, she had to do for survival, which then had an effect on me. So even just thinking about the fact that if my mother could afford to have a childminder to look after my sisters and I, then of course she would have done that, right? But I had to do that so she could go to work, so we could survive. And so I think there's these things that in one breath that are is quite intentional from people, but there's things that I also acknowledge, especially from within the community. It's still intentional, but also sometimes not. And what I say that is because of that example of, at the time, my mum unfortunately just sort of it as a rite of passage. This is what the eldest daughter does. You look after your younger siblings. This is what you do. Now she can understand um, how it's affected me and what it means in terms of how I just navigate with people, and how I move. In one breath, it's been very, it's in, for me personally, it's worked in my favor because I'm good at managing and project managing. And I think that comes from managing all my siblings. However, there is those lasting effects that it does mean that actually, how do I be in community with my sisters and be my sister's sister without feeling like I am the authoritative figure? Like, and so yeah, just wanted to kind of just put in that thing around, I guess, just like class, and how there is also, especially thinking about sometimes within the community, it's just this thing that is just seen as acceptable and just what happens with the eldest daughter. So yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And I think it just goes to show what really stood out to me there was conversations. I've seen a lot of people like us and others start to have conversations with our parents about these issues, who really would just, in many cases, although there are other, exceptions, that were just doing their best under the circumstances that they were in. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about that link in terms of adultification bias and sexual violence. So Heritage, would you be able to talk to us a little bit more about why we need to talk about this issue in relation to sexual violence? So we've alluded to it and we've spoken about it, but I'd really like to get a bit deeper into why it matters in this conversation of sexual violence.
Okay, I think the two things I would really love to highlight, and that's the prevention of sexual violence and then funding, because one of the themes for the 16 days of activism is actually investing in prevention of violence against women and girls. And you would see that when it comes to funding, if there's anything people say is money doesn't lie, so you can always tell where the seriousness of something is going to. For example, when there's a budget, you can tell the priority of the government when it comes to funding. And that's the same thing with funding. When you see that Black communities and even organizations that are targeted towards actually addressing this matter, you would see that they're very underfunded, and in most cases they would have to raise the funds within the organization just to help certain Black girls and women. So funding is a major issue. And I was saying initially that there's a danger in thinking that adultification bias is just a very abstract issue, because it boils down into sexual violence. It boils down into prevention of sexual violence, reporting sexual violence. So a girl who knows that on a normal day she's not seen as someone who has the right to even bring forward a report or would be taken seriously, as opposed to someone else coming and saying, oh, this happened to me, I need help, and their response. So that girl is less likely to report in the case that she is violated. And in most cases, this goes under the rug and we don't get to hear about it. So this also goes down to how the attitude of the community and how we respond to cases like this. So prevention on its own, we're also talking about what are the interventions with non-state actors and CSOs and even other bodies. We're talking about the media. How does the media present issues like this, emphasizing that a Black girl, that color, and just emphasizing and bringing light to the fact that, oh, this might not be as serious as something else. So there's also that undertone. There's the victim blaming culture that would also boil down to reporting when they see that they have some sort of responsibility. There's always a danger in transferring responsibility, that you are responsible, solely responsible for what happens to you when you're out in the street. That is something that the Black community has faced constantly. We have been given that responsibility. You are strong enough, you are, capable, and the whole responsibility lies on you. And so when anything happens, you immediately believe that it is because you have failed at that responsibility, in quotes. So when this is, in any other scenario with any other race, they are most likely to think, okay, she was violated, as opposed to she failed to protect herself. So this is, the undertones in the media, and even in schools. I really love the fact that we are talking about real stories here, as we might think that this is just like numbers and this is just one of those issues. These are real stories. There are faces behind these stories, and we must acknowledge that.
Exactly. Thank you so much for that. I think what you said about the media is so important, and I was going to touch on that as well. So thank you for bringing that up, because I think the media has a role to play in general when it comes to sexual violence and other forms of violence, and just gender-based violence in general. And we see that adultification play out very heavily in the media. We see it when we have stories where we're empathizing with the victim, who is perhaps a Black girl in foster care or something like that. I'm thinking of a specific movie in my head, but that's all we see. And also, I think what Kafaya said about class is really important, because what we don't want is that as people like us start to educate ourselves and or continue to educate ourselves and move into different circles and things, that we forget about the class element of things. Sometimes it can feel like you can get into a space where you feel like things are better or we're making progress, but then that might be for a certain type of Black woman, in the same way as that it is actually the case with a certain type of white woman or Asian woman. We know that girls in foster care and things, and also girls with different sexualities as well, are also suffer from adultification bias as well. So I think what I find really promising about bringing these issues into the forefront and into the mainstream is that by addressing this issue that we have an understanding of within our community, and we continue to get greater understanding, bringing that into the mainstream, it actually supports all. It lifts everybody up. And that's how it generally is when you work on these issues that are severely impacting marginalized groups. And we've talked quite a bit about schools and reference governments as well. So how do you think that people, organizations, or governments, or feel free to touch on all three, can actually step forward and take action on this? You spoke about funding heritage, and absolutely right. 16 Days of Activism this year's key theme is, alongside no excuse, hashtag there's no excuse for gender-based violence, is also invest to end and to prevent gender-based violence from happening in the first place. And this is really key, because we know the solutions. Feminist led organizations that are working in these spaces, we know the issue, we know the solutions, and where we need more detail on the issue, we just need more funding for research. We just need more funding for services. We just need more funding for a holistic approach to how things are done within certain sectors of the public in order to address these issues. So again, going back to that question, how can people, organizations, or governments step forward and take action on this, Kafaya?
Ooh, in one breath, with the government, there's something for me where at first I wanted to say the government can't save us, we have to save ourselves, if I'm being really honest. I think there are things they can do, but I want to start off with community. I think there's something about, for us, like there's something about in-house for us really acknowledging what the adultification of young Black girls, like what does that mean? How is it affecting us? And I guess, as we've spoken about, the conversations we are having with our mothers, the conversations we're having in community, is a great way to start with identifying that actually, no, this thing is affecting me. You treating me like an adult but equally still a child affects me in this very deep way. I think for me, there's a big thing here with the lens of having a social work background, safeguarding. Our young people, young women are in school a high percentage of the time, and that is a place where they should feel safe. And so for me, I think there's this real need for, with safeguarding training, yes, there is something about how we look after and protect children from harm, but there also has to be this intersectional lens that happens. There has to be an understanding of what racism is for us to even to be able to unpick, like adultification bias too. And I think if we're able for people to really understand that there is this thing, that racism that's very rife, then afterwards we'll be able to move into some of these other pockets of the way we see racism show up. I think in terms of the government, yeah, I think that's something I still really have to think about. And think about actually how can the government really shift things. And yes, there's things like mandatory training. Yes, there's things for like teachers or educate in educational settings. But I think there has to be this real shift of just understanding the needs of those who are most marginalized. And I think until that is truly considered, I think it's going to be really hard to shift things, if I'm being honest. So,
yeah, thank you so much. Really good answer there. Heritage, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I think, yeah, I quite agree. It's going to be very difficult, especially since we do not even have the base covered in that sense. So not everyone really knows about the issue. There's still very much room for improvement in terms of awareness and collective action. So I would recommend actually that we start with that dialogue of just like having conversations with people in government, and getting them to even understand the issue in the first place. Because you definitely can't fund an issue if you think it is not an issue in the first place. People would bring up the excuse of, oh, there's the economic states, cost of living, and everything is going up. So why should we address our adultification bias, and why should we fund movements that are working to end this? And so I feel that dialogue is so important. We definitely need mechanisms of partnerships. I think the UN Women it's one of those UAM UK specifically is one of those organizations that have done so much work on that, and I think I highly commend that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Heritage. And what really stood out to me there is that, well, first of all, Kafaya with the communities, but also having those conversations. And we always say, I want a seat at the table, but I'm like, they need to come to the table. The table's here, it's laid, it's got a big feast of information on it for them. Come to the table and start having those conversations. And I think that is a lot of the work that we at UN Women UK are doing and continue to do, thankfully with the support of our amazing community, which both of you are part of. Because like you say, I said this a lot at a recent event, you don't know what you don't know. Unfortunately, until we continue to prod and say, this is an issue, this is how it impacts, this is how it crosses all these different intersectionalities. We've talked about race, we've talked about class, we've talked about disability, sexuality. Adultification is having a huge impact on the actual sexual violence taking place, and then how communities respond to that, how those people heal, whether they're able to seek support because they blame themselves, but also how the criminal justice system treats that as well, and other systems, other government systems that are designed to support survivors. And I think that when I think about the government, I think about those key institutions that the government has responsibility for, like the police, like the education system, like hospitals, like schools. And I think about having that conversation, bringing this topic to the forefront, and then saying, how do we look at these institutions and see how this issue is pervasive within those systems? And I think that one other thing that I thought about was about the trainings and things. We have, various different trainings that take place in these organizations. How intersectional are they? Yes, Kafaya. Okay. How intersectional are these training sessions? You know, is this topic being brought into that training? So it's not necessarily even needing to reinvent the wheel, but it's taking what already exists. It's taking the training that already exists and making it intersectional and bringing this information in there. All of that also requires funding. And I think, going back to what Heritage said, these things need to be properly funded. The organizations exist, the information is there, the knowledge is there. There are people working really hard on this day in, day out that want to see this end. So yeah, that's key. Did anyone want to add anything on that? Yeah.
Yeah, do you know what? Just revisiting this thing around, I guess, the government and funding, which you both have said so greatly. I think there's something, without going into the politics of who is currently in power, I think there is this real thing around, really, if you think about like the margin to the center, and then thinking about those who are most marginalized, and thinking about, if we support their needs, actually we can support everyone. And what I mean by that is, if we're thinking about the young people who are most affected by adultification, if we was to support their needs, I'm sure for the most part we will support most or majority of young people's needs. And so I think about, actually, what are the provisions for young people generally, even if we move away from the specific needs of those who are being for young people. There are no after school clubs. Where are the spaces for young people to have fun and be young and run around in the playground in the same way that we did at once upon a time? And I think that there is something about the government really putting money into spaces that allowed, I know for myself, that my parents were able to work longer because I was in after school club. And so I was in football, basketball, every type of after school club there could be, because it meant that there was a place for me to have a bit of fun while my parents were able to work. And I think where we currently the government that we have is not allowing young people to just be young and have fun and be free. And I think there is definitely something about kind of the youth provision that is really missing right now in the UK, which then means that young people are at home and online, and we're seeing the way in which, I guess, racism, sexism, whatever it may be, is then happening online. It's the same thing, but just in a different space. And we're seeing videos of young Black women being attacked after school, and these things that actually are continuing to perpetuate and almost feel worse because we can see it in real time. We can see what's happening in Nottingham, in Manchester, with young Black women. So yeah, I just think there's just something about youth provision generally that I think also helps support some of these issues, because it creates spaces for young people to be young and free and have fun. So yeah.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Kafaya. And I think, I think it's really important to note that this isn't about any political party or any specific organization. Everyone can do this. We have to find a way that, in the current time that we have, working together with those individuals. And I think that that's a really important point to make, because it's not about expecting the conditions to be perfect to suddenly now address this issue. We need to address this issue right now. And I think that awareness piece, and then, like you say, looking at those provisions that already exist, whether that be youth services, whether that be social services, whether that be education providers, hospitals, etc., all the things I mentioned before. How are we looking at this issue within those different spaces? The places are there, the experts are there. How can we adapt existing trainings in order to address that? How can we add on additional services in order to address this issue? So yeah, thank you so much for that. So that was actually the last of my questions on adultification bias. I think we could talk about this forever. Thank you so much for sharing. I just wanted to ask you, how can we connect, and how can anybody watching this connect and reach out to you going forward? We'll put all your links in the bio, but are you on Instagram and whatnot? Just tell us your handles and yeah. Kafaya?
So my Instagram, LinkedIn, currently not on Twitter because it's a lot right now on Twitter, but it's all my name. So if you just type in my name, you'll find me. I'm there. Reach out to me. I'm friendly.
Amazing. And Heritage, how can we connect to you and your organization?
Yes, the name is Heritage Sanmi-Lawal. Actually, I just joined Twitter, strangely enough. So yeah, on all platforms, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, I just joined TikTok as well. Have no idea what I'm doing there yet, but I'm on the space already. So for my organization, Her Dream Initiative is just also on all platforms as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I think I wanted to end on a few points really, and bring us back to, and we have spoke about this a lot towards the end of this conversation around that investing to end violence against women and girls. In this case, we don't really understand the extent of the issue, and we need funding to not only provide the services or the training that's required to root this issue out, but also to understand the actual issue. That's really key. Thank you so much for participating, Kafayat and Heritage. All the links to everything we discussed will be shared in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and please do, if you can, donate to our own initiative or share the donation link, which will also be linked in the description. And thank you so much for watching this series. I hope you've enjoyed this. Go back and watch the others if you haven't, and enjoy the rest of 16 Days of Activism. And I look forward to seeing you again next year.
Don't forget to donate to Safe Spaces now, link next to the video.